bit of mensch.
Whatever you think.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah,
Oh,
absolutely.
you've got what?
I'll be okay. Thank you. Activist in the UFT. You can say that instead of NYC for abortion rights. What?
Is someone that?
What?
Someone keeping time, or should we keep time?
Ronnie will keep time.
Okay. In terms of like indications.
I wonder if Noah can see us.
You're up there reading your tape.
I think they put him over there so that you could.
It's like live now, so yeah.
Let's go, Yankees.
Said the guy in the Niners shirt. Yeah, you can probably also.
I want to see Noah. Can you put him on the preview, but not live?
Don't cut off my mic in 10 minutes. That makes sense.
That's what I say. You're good. You're good.
Hello, Noah. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Noah, can you say something again?
Yep, can you hear me right now? Testing, testing, 1, 2, testing, testing.
Cool, thanks.
Are you going to? I don't think so. My impression is it's going to be a one day. Me too.
I know. Were you in the emails about the call on Monday? There's going to be like a Zoom call.
I did. Nick from Chicago, and I was like, can you ask Brian first? As far as contacts and stuff. Like, I don't know. Maybe we should talk about it.
I just finished a homework assignment for my master's class that was due right before this. So I've had to like neglect a little bit of the organizing for the past few
You
weeks.
just totally talk about your masters.
Democratic Socialists of America, and thank you to Verso Books for hosting the event as well tonight. I'm Ronnie, and I am a public school teacher in New York City. And we're here today to draw some lessons from the recent Teachers Rebellion, which marks the first strike wave in this country since the 1970s. What's particularly exciting, I think, about this strike wave, despite the very fact that there is a strike wave, is where it's taking place. It's taking place in an area of the country that had been written off as irredeemably right-wing, as hopelessly backwards. But I think what the Teachers Rebellion has shown us instead is that there is a working class in that part of the country that has suffered tremendously from decades of attacks by the rich, and that this working class will fight for justice when there is an alternative presented to it. We saw teachers from West Virginia to Arizona fighting to improve their schools, independent of what they're told, what they were told by their politicians or even their union officials. We saw them stand up for not only better wages, although that's important, but for their students, their families, and other public sector workers, and so on. And the outpour of solidarity from the strikers, I think, reverberated throughout the country and reflected back to the teachers as thousands of workers and students showed their solidarity by posting photos on social media, by collecting and sending strike donations, by traveling to witness and learn from the strikers themselves. We're here tonight to also draw lessons from the strikes that have taken place remarkably in right-to-work states. And as right-to-work threatens to engulf the entire country, it is more important than ever to prepare ourselves to fight in the potentially new era of class struggle. And luckily, we have hundreds and thousands of educators who have shown us how to fight. I want to introduce our speakers tonight. Our speakers include Noah Kay. Noah is a leader of Arizona Educators United and a K-8 music teacher. We have Eric B. We have Eric B. with us as well. Eric has written on labor movements, past and present, including for Jacobin Magazine, formerly a high school teacher in the Bay Area, and he is a doctoral student in the Sociology department in NYU. And we also have Leia P. with us tonight. Leia is a socialist and activist living in Brooklyn. She's also a member of the International Socialist Organization and an activist in the New York City Teachers Union, the UFT. And we have Ryan B., who is a high school special education teacher in New York City, a rank-and-file activist in the UFT, and an organizer with DSA teachers. Give them a round of applause. Okay, how this is going to work is that each of our speakers will speak for about 10 minutes. I will then pose some questions in the panel that they can answer. After 20 minutes of moderated Q&A, we'll have some announcements from the floor, and then we'll kind of wrap things up with each of them speaking for about 2 minutes toward the end. And then that'll be it, basically, for the live stream. I encourage people from the audience to stick around, to enjoy refreshments, also to strike up conversations. No pun intended. Pun intended. So without further ado, I'd like to begin with Noah.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This is kind of weird. I can't see everybody there, but I'm assuming that I'm talking to a room full of people. So thanks for coming out. I'm going to get right to it and give you guys some of the main lessons here that we've learned from Arizona. And I think Arizona presents in my opinion, a really successful case of this movement, and a couple really powerful things, especially because it did happen in a heavily conservative area in a right-to-work state. It really has some powerful lessons. So one of the first things that I would tell anybody who's involved in this, especially educators or people who are working at schools, and the thing that we've really had the advantage of here in Arizona is being able to look at these different movements that have happened in the last couple months. So I think that's one of the biggest lessons, is to use these past movements is essentially a blueprint. And that's what we did here in Arizona. And what we ended up with was what I believe is a really well-organized, just well-oiled infrastructure here. So we've learned a lot of different things from that. And so the biggest thing I would say before you get into this, and this is obvious, but before anything moves, it's organize, 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 organize. And when you think you have every single detail organized, go back and double check them and organize it even more. That's the thing that has had to be so really kind of over the top, especially in a large state like Arizona. So for example, we started with a Facebook page, but the Facebook page really just blew up. And so very quickly we had to make an email list, and we had to quickly make separate Facebook pages. We had to onboard moderators and really streamline everything. And that's just the social media aspect of it. That is such a huge undertaking to make sure that you have some sort of communications infrastructure organized. So that's one of the biggest things that I would say right out of the gates. Make sure that you have that set. And then within that, sorry, I'm going to take this off because I'm getting a weird feedback here. And then within that, the biggest thing for Arizona is we created a network of leaders that we called site liaisons. And each one of these site liaisons is a teacher, but they double as an organizer. So they sign up, of course, just a volunteer action that they take, and they sign up, and they're in charge of their entire site and organizing their entire site. And so what we thought was essentially, an opportunity to help organize this movement and have teachers become more involved and speak with their campuses really became one of the defining aspects of our movement, because we had over 2,000 site liaisons, educator organizers, all across the state, and they put in incredible amounts of energy and new ideas and infrastructure into this. So having a really just widespread infrastructure of the workers and the educators really leading this thing, that I think is one of the pivotal takeaways from what we have here in Arizona. So really making sure that it's well organized, and then folded within that infrastructure, we have all of these different local leaders. And that's been one of the pivotal things. In talking to some of the people who are on the ground, like Eric, for example, who's here tonight, I think he really saw some of that power that's in that, and having the local leadership really empowered. And it wasn't just that they were site liaisons. It was that we really gave them a lot of control. We gave them a lot of authority to do their own actions, to plan their own things, to engage in unique ways, especially in their communities. That was a pivotal thing here in Arizona. And so kind of piggybacking off that, so my main two so far, make sure everything is really organized, just a really just well-oiled machine. And then within that is part of this infrastructure of local leaders, especially if you're doing something statewide for an educator movement like this. And then within that, we have really tried to make an effort to be as grassroots and as democratic as possible at every single turn. So what I think the magic of this movement is the local leadership, and that local leadership being really empowered and being able to have a voice. For one of the first times in history, educators really have a strong voice now. And it's not only being heard, but it's being acted upon. So what we did was we regularly used Action Network to put out polls for next steps. Now, there were times when, just because of the strategic nature of what we were doing, or the timeline, we weren't able to always get a full democratic poll out to every single member. We ended up with well over 50,000 members just in the Facebook page alone, and a lot outside of there. So it's really hard to poll 70,000 people in even 24 hours. But any time that we could, we did a really thorough democratic vote on every single action, and those were led by the site liaisons. They did a lot of the lifting on organizing that, planning all those different things. So those are kind of my core lessons that I take out of this: organize, local leadership, democratic infrastructure whenever you can, and especially in right to work states, using our allies was really a powerful thing. Hey, can you guys hear me? We back? Okay, sorry. Okay. I'm not sure what's happening here. Okay, you want me to just go with audio? Okay, sorry, not sure what happened there. So, beyond these sort of lessons, I think one of the biggest takeaways that we have from Arizona
In almost all of these states, you have an organized mass movement now. You have a working class that feels its power and that is not going to stop fighting anytime soon. And so that, to my mind, is the really important gain, the most important gain from any strike, and these strikes in particular, is it's given working class folks in these states a sense of organization, a sense of consciousness, and a sense of courage to fight back that maybe even just 2 months ago they didn't have. And that is a really hard thing for the ruling class to take away, and it's one of the reasons we should be optimistic about prospects for our side. So I think the question then becomes, if you look at the three strikes in comparison, we should draw some of the strategic lessons for us as radicals. It's easy to just stress the good things, and so I just did that. But we should also look at some of the strengths and limitations. So, in particular, I think it's useful to look at Oklahoma and compare that to West Virginia and Arizona, because what I just stressed is that in some ways the big gain from these strikes so far has been the level of organization and mobilization has significantly increased in West Virginia and Arizona. That didn't happen to the same extent in Oklahoma. And the question is why? Why is that the case? It's not to bash on Oklahoma. They I think, were just as militant, and the protests in some ways were even bigger, and the organizers were very courageous. And so it raises the question, to my mind, of the central role of what we could call like a militant minority is, which is that basically in West Virginia and Arizona, you had some radicals with radical politics, with some experience organizing, capable of leading and initiating these strikes. It made a huge difference. And so in Oklahoma, you didn't have that same layer, and you can see how that played out differently in the different strikes. So it's important to stress the role of organizers, because that gets left out. Sometimes it's West Virginia or any of these strikes is portrayed very like a spontaneous struggle. People have heard that. It's just like, things were bad and people fought back. And for those of us who have some organizing experience, we know that's very rarely the case and usually not the case. And it's definitely what didn't happen in West Virginia. They organized for months before they called for a strike. They did major buildups. And the type of organizing that Noah described earlier, that is what it takes. And that's not easy. That's not It's not obvious if you don't have some sort of politics and organizing experience. And so the really amazing thing, to my mind, is in some ways even less West Virginia and more Arizona. Because West Virginia did have a level of labor traditions that we can point to. I think that in some ways that gets exaggerated, that in some ways those traditions were dying down and it took the organizing to revive them. But let's just bracket West Virginia for a second. If we look at Arizona, if there was one state in the country where you would not expect a mass strike to be successful, I think it would be Arizona, right? This is a bastion of the right wing. This is the ground zero for privatization. It's ground zero for anti-immigrant attacks, right? This is like the right wing's baby. They don't want to give it up, right? And so when we look at the organizing that has happened in that state and the profound transformation of educators and working class people generally, that really puts into sharp relief the amazing organizing efforts of people like Noah and their whole team. And it raises the question then of trying to build a similar layer of militants in other states, so when similar opportunities arise, those advantages can be fully taken and not missed, like to a certain extent they were in Oklahoma. And so when we talk, I think, about the need and the role that a militant minority can play, that's not to say that every time you have socialists or radicals in a workplace, you can just lead a strike. That's clearly not the case, right? Conditions have to be ripe, and we don't generally control when those conditions arise. But they do periodically arise, and then the question becomes, do we as radicals have a base in workplaces and communities so that we can lead at those moments when time for a strike is possible, right? And that raises a real strategic question that I'm hoping that we can discuss, and I think is broadly posed for the left in this country, is how do we reconnect with the labor movement as a whole? How do we reconnect with our class? Because we were more or less forcefully divorced from our class in the 1950s through McCarthyism. We haven't fully been able to reconnect. And that's really hard. It's going to take a lot of time. But I think in some ways the big lesson for me, one of the big lessons from these strikes, is that the role of socialists and radicals is way beyond sometimes our numbers when we're orienting to workplace struggles. And we've seen that in these strikes, and I hope that we'll continue to see it. And I'm hoping in discussions like these can play a role in kind of generalizing these lessons, because there's no there's no shortcut. I think we don't know how long the strike wave will last. We don't know whether it'll spread to other sectors. I hope so, but we don't know. That being said, I think that the rise in class politics, if we look at the rise of Bernie Sanders, if we look at the growth of different socialist groups in the last 2 years, and then we look at these strikes, I think that should give us a lot of optimism and confidence in our class, and I think that's a time to be bold, and that we should expect there to be more struggle and orient towards that. And I think with people like this in the room and across the country, we should have a lot of confidence in our ability not just to fight, but to win. So I'll leave it at that.
You have Noah back? Okay, still trying to get Noah.
Okay.
In the meantime, we'll move on to Leia.
Cool. Thanks, everyone, for being here, and thanks to the organizations that put this together. So I'm going to start with a quote by Hal Draper, who's a British socialist who wrote this during the 1970s. He said, "To engage in class struggle, it is not necessary to believe in class struggle any more than it is necessary to believe in Newton in order to fall from an airplane. The working class moves toward class struggle insofar as capitalism fails to satisfy its economic and social needs and aspirations, not insofar as it is told about struggle by Marxists. There is no evidence that workers like to struggle any more than anyone else. The evidence is that capitalism compels and accustoms them to do so." There has been a bipartisan neoliberal war on public education. Chronic underfunding, school building deterioration, privatization, school closures, low pay, a testing regime that leaves billions in their pocketbooks and makes the rest of our lives complete hell. Lead in our schools, drinking water, mice-infested classrooms or offices, in the case of me, large class sizes, high teacher turnover. In New York City, the average teacher tenure turnover rate is 5 years, an increase in healthcare costs. So in some ways, it should come as no surprise, right, that thousands of teachers and education workers have withheld their labor, walked in, walked out, stormed Capitol buildings, and to demand a better life for themselves, for their students, and for the families that we serve. At the same time, it did come as a surprise, including to the people who went out. And you cannot witness this strike wave without asking, well, why now? Who's next? And most excitedly, could it be us? So far, the strike wave, which started in West Virginia, significantly shutting down the entire state. People in this room are wearing the T-shirts, 55 strong. It's inspired similar actions and strikes in Oklahoma, Kentucky, New Jersey, Puerto Rico, Arizona, Colorado, and just yesterday, actually, LA teachers voted to have a sympathy strike with custodians and teaching assistants who were organized by SEIU threatening to strike, and a tentative agreement is now underway because of that threat. In Durham, North Carolina, school has already been canceled May 16th due to more than half the teachers requesting a personal day to protest at the Capitol. Socialists understand that it is the conditions of capitalism which give people no other choice but to struggle. And when struggle is underway, meaning working class people realizing their own power by shutting things down, then the political terrain on which we daily normalize our powerlessness, our despair, our low expectations of ourselves and others, this all begins to shift. I'm a guidance counselor, so I spend a lot of my time, for better or for worse, kind of talking to people and my other coworkers about kind of being our best self. And I can say without a doubt that class struggle is our best self. Marx called the modern, class struggle. Marx called the modern working class the universal class, meaning that for workers to win, whether this be a demand for higher pay or ultimately our own freedom, we must also struggle collectively for real democracy and against all forms of oppression. These are not conclusions that people often draw prior to struggle, but in the process of struggle itself. And this was evident in every single state where teachers were under rebellion. Puerto Rico teachers cannot win unless questions of U.S. colonial interests are also challenged. They cannot win until charter schools and privatization is also challenged. And until state repression, because they were met with their one-day strike May 1st with massive police repression, until that state repression is challenged as well. And these fights then go beyond the interest of just those teachers. And when that happens, when teachers in West Virginia, many of whom voted for Trump, began to identify more with teachers in Puerto Rico than the political class that they just struck against, then real potential exists for our class. And I think that's what you see in terms of being a class in motion. Because when the working class is in motion, our impulses are more democratic. Our impulses bend towards solidarity. And that's why the most important thing that comes out of it, which I think Eric articulated well, is not just what the contract says, although of course that's important, but what kind of organization comes out of it, what kind of confidence our side has, what kind of ideas that exist in our own minds that couldn't have existed before. Schools are historically sites of social struggle. And not just because of the conditions of the schools themselves. It's because there's a contradiction between what education promises on the one hand, a universal, even playing field, equality, confronted with its reality, which is the lived reality that we all experience, whether you're working or attending a public school. And this is why every civil rights and racial justice movement in this country has also included the fight for public education. Schools are also sites of struggle because when you work in them, you get a glimpse of just about everything that's wrong with capitalism. Katie Endicott, who was a West Virginia striker who spoke in New York City, talked about witnessing the decline of coal in that state and the rising opioid epidemic through her students in her classroom. Families that she taught that once prospered, that they were now in their school raising money for their electricity bills collectively to send their students home with every month. In New York City schools, we witnessed top students with families facing deportation that can no longer concentrate in class. A school-to-prison pipeline that means there are more school safety NYPD employees in schools than there are guidance counselors like myself. Kids living 10 deep in 2-bedroom apartments. The limitations of what you can achieve as a teacher or a guidance counselor become apparent very quickly, and at a certain point necessitates much more than longer hours at work, but instead a struggle outside the classroom for school funding, for housing, a struggle for universal health care, an end to deportations and mass incarceration. Socialists must be the ones connecting these dots. And what's been most inspiring to me about the recent strike wave, as is the case with so many movements, is a sense, that feeling of like a dam breaking, a collective feeling that enough isn't enough, and if they can do it, then why not me? I think many of us probably feel this way as an individual all the time. I always think about the analogy of myself, of like, there's only so many times you can be sexually harassed walking down the street without eventually lashing out. But lashing out as an individual does very little, right, to actually change sexual harassment in society. It actually can put yourself in danger when doing so, which is why collective struggle is so significant, because collectively saying enough is enough actually has the potential to bring greater confidence, greater organization, and produce more radicals and socialists from that struggle that see workers' power as a realistic strategy for fighting back. And it's why strikes are unique and have more potential to bring about radical ideas, both in society and in ourselves. So how many here have been on strike? Okay, a few. How many have been on a successful strike? Okay, a few. Congrats, you're a small minority of our room and society. I think that it's significant because it's just hard to, most people, it's very hard to conceive of workers running society if they've never felt a glimpse of that power themselves, in their daily life. And I think that this hopefully is beginning to change, certainly for education workers across the country. Because what's unique about strikes, which is different than even social movements that also have a collective power of their own, is that they bring to the surface the question of power and who holds it. And socialists, we look to the collective action of the working class, not just because it's the majority of people in society, although the kind of we are many and they are few is not nothing, but because it's our labor which makes society run. So when MTA workers in New York City in 2005 went on strike, people couldn't get to work. When teachers go on strike, schools don't open. That's power. Strikes are an exercise in power, a power most of us have never felt in our lifetime. And again, hopefully that's beginning to change. The closest I came, I'd never been on strike before. I've been in the Department of Education for 10 years. Our last strike was decades ago. Was when we defended Occupy Wall Street from Bloomberg during his first invasion. He threatened to strike and evict the camps. It was coordinated nationally thanks to Barack Obama. And they tried to strike, and the working class of New York showed up at 5 in the morning in the dark, ready for battle, and they couldn't get in. They couldn't stop it. And I hold on to that, right, at the moment where I felt real power. And not to belittle that, but that's nothing compared to real power that you feel during a strike, during an occupation, when you begin to not just shut something down, but actually begin to run it. Because that's the other thing that's significant about the working class, is that we don't have the power just to shut things down. We have the power to actually resurrect. And every single citywide general strike that's happened in this country, workers not only shut down entire cities like Seattle or Minneapolis, but began to resurrect entire cities on a fundamentally different basis. Smaller glimpses of this were seen in Madison during the Capitol occupation in 2011, and just more recently in Standing Rock, which I had the kind of honor of witnessing. These are protests and strikes that turn into a reorganization of entire communities on fundamentally different values. Again, this is why Marxists see the working class as a universal class. So I'll end, a couple minutes left, but just a couple of thoughts on kind of what's next. Kim Moody, who's a socialist and labor writer, wrote in his most recent book, "Labor movements seldom grow significantly by increments over extended periods. Rather, they tend to grow rapidly in the midst of explosive and usually unpredictable strike waves or leaps. The accumulation of inflammable materials that underlay these waves of strikes and union growth had to become generalized and widely experienced before an explosion was likely. Although we can see plenty of signs of resistance and the feelings of injustice that mobilization theory tells us precedes any upsurge, it's impossible to fully gauge the subjective factor, which Eric spoke to, needed to set things in motion. Predictions of an upsurge are almost always a futile pursuit. What is needed now is not crystal ball gazing, but preparation. I believe there's a newfound militancy that we have to support and cohere. When we have the opportunity to take part directly in these strikes, we should push to democratize them, politicize them, and build independent organization out of them. When we don't, we must muster and organize every ounce of solidarity possible, from pizza deliveries to socialist delegations to the striking cities and states. So by democratize, I mean build rank and file organization in schools and in our unions, whether that you can do that through your union or the site liaison kind of model that I think Noah spoke to. Because struggle is where we often find our voice for the first time, and if self-emancipation must be the act of the working class, then we must push to democratize our movements and unions to the highest degree possible. We will never be able to run society if we have no experience running a strike. To politicize, socialists should also be the ones at the forefront of linking what often start with purely economic demands, such as higher pay or school funding, to questions of racial and gender justice. Make no mistake, these strike waves are being led by women who've been put up with a lot of shit throughout their lives. And going on strike, becoming leaders in their schools, is going to change them forever. And it's going to change how their husbands, their partners, their kids, their parents also see them in this world. In New York City, it's inconceivable that we would have a successful strike without taking up the question on why it is that the schools that serve black and brown students are the buildings that are the most deteriorated and the schools that are the least funded. Socialists have a responsibility to bring these social questions to the front and center and not sideline them for fear of alienating or appealing to a false understanding of unity. Very last sentence. We need to build independent organization. Struggles that take place in the public sector will have the largest pull towards electoral solutions. And this is to be expected because politicians are our bosses. But there's a danger here. The rank-and-file organizations we build must be politically independent and have democratic spaces for socialists and others to debate and discuss with the goal of winning a strategy around workers' power in place of electoral power. Thank you.
Thanks, Leia. We're going to continue with Ryan. I don't believe we have connection with Noah yet, so we'll go with you.
Great. Good evening. My name is Ryan Bruckenthal. I am a high school special education teacher here in New York City. I am a rank-and-file UFT activist and a member of the movement of rank-and-file educators. I am also an organizer with DSA teachers here in New York City and nationally. So the title of tonight is Lessons from the Teacher Uprisings, and I can't say enough how many lessons we are learning from every uprising and every strike that we're witnessing. Noah put it as the movements are blueprints for us to be learning from and implement and try and figure how we can use them in our context, and that is certainly what's going on here. So let me start by talking about the New York City context. So Leah, myself, and a couple others are organizing in New York City. In New York State, private sector employees just got paid parental leave. In New York City, non-union city employees also just got paid parental leave. However, for us as unionized public employees, we do not yet have paid parental leave, and more importantly, we do not have paid family leave. There was sort of an asterisk at the bottom of this bill when it was passed saying that we will bargain it into our next contracts, and so that's what's going on right now. However, we find that our existing union leadership is having closed-door negotiations with the city, and is not engaging the type of campaign that we think will be necessary to be able to fight for paid family leave without any givebacks. Now, this is not to say that they're not doing anything, and they certainly are. However, we, as the rank and file teachers and more, are thinking that paid family leave can be our wedge issue, that we can mobilize people around to get the types of movements that we're seeing in states like West Virginia, like Oklahoma, Arizona, Colorado, Arizona. This is an issue that can mobilize young members of the UFT who are thinking about having families in the future, but it can also mobilize older members who maybe have parents who are aging. This is an issue that connects us in the schools to also healthcare. And I do want to talk a couple times about the connection between education and healthcare because I think it's very evident in all of these moments and all of these strikes. So again, in New York City, our contract is expiring in November. We are trying to use the blueprints that we're witnessing from these struggles, see what we can learn from them, see what we can implement to get the type of movement that we know it'll take to get paid family leave here in New York City. So, first lessons from West Virginia, I would say, is a successful way of implementing a rank and file strategy. It's a rank and file strategy that sees teachers as the leaders of their unions, as the ones who set the pace and set the tone of how to organize, the ones who organize the escalating tactics that it takes to lead a state out on strike, and the ones who ultimately have the power and infrastructure to be able to chant their union leadership back to the table, no deal, when the union leadership feels like there's a good enough deal that was taken. Now, I want to stress, this is not to say that these teachers are just criticizing their union leadership. Instead, it is the opposite. It is that they themselves recognize they are the union, and they go forward and they organize from school to set up the type of infrastructure that will be needed for a strike and to maintain the union. Now, as a little bit of a recognition to the existing union leadership and to the union infrastructure, we also see that engaging in direct action and struggle is a way to build the union and to get members. In this moment, when the Janus decision will very likely bring right to work to New York City and all of the public sector, we can look to places like West Virginia, where teachers who were not members of a union saw that the union was relevant to organizing a strike that spoke to the issues that mattered to them, to funding PEIA and to getting pay raises, and immediately afterwards joining the union, recognizing that there needs to be organization and that there needs to be infrastructure to maintain that struggle and to continue it. So I think that is a lot of the lessons that I built from West Virginia. I'll also say, talking about the pizza deliveries and other forms of solidarity, solidarity was a key thing that we saw in West Virginia and the other states, but solidarity took many forms. That including all public sector workers in the 55 United, not just saying it's teachers, but it's all educators and all public sector workers. That also means some private sector workers going on sympathy strike with the teachers, and that also means connecting teachers from around the country into a network to communicate and to learn from each other and to give lessons, ultimately, from those who had been out on strike before. So, I think that's good with West Virginia. Oklahoma, I agree with much of Eric's assessment, which is that Oklahoma was incredibly inspiring, and it was a similarly massive action in which solidarity was at the forefront. I think what ultimately resulted in Oklahoma's perhaps less successful end was the lack of real rank and file organization. And so we did a lot to try and build that in the short moments that led up to Oklahoma, including creating Zoom calls and conference calls, connecting West Virginia and Arizona teachers with Oklahoma teachers, trying to tell the lessons of the experience when the union leadership was going to take the lesser deal, but then the members themselves had the capacity to be able to demand them to go back to the table. And this was very relevant also when we spoke with the Oklahoma teachers, because it looked like the Senate was going to pass a less than perfect bill. And just by connecting these union activists and these teacher militants to talk about their experiences and hearing Oklahoma teachers say, I hadn't thought of it that way. So ultimately, I think what is going to be necessary in Oklahoma and all these states is the school-to-school organization and the rank-and-file organization that was present in West Virginia and in Arizona. Luckily, the conversations are being had to build that now. So maybe this strike wasn't the one that can get all their demands, but they recognize that, and they're learning from their own blueprints that they set of ways to adapt and ways to change for the next time that it comes around. Because as we see, these struggles are going to continue. For as long as we live in the system that we live, we will always be struggling. And so we have to learn from our mistakes and continue to build and continue to organize. I guess I'll also shout out my political organization, DSA, again, in Oklahoma. So a form of solidarity that we played was by helping organize a delivery of pizzas to the state capitol. So when teachers from around the country raised funds and actually organized to get this done, it took DSA members in the local Oklahoma area to be the ones to pick up those pizzas and to walk them to the stairs. So that is real solidarity in action, and that was definitely seen by the teachers. And more importantly, for perhaps newly radicalized folks, it showed what it means to engage in a struggle in ways to truly show solidarity. So I guess last I'll talk about Arizona, and of course, again, we want to talk. I would love to shout out Puerto Rico and Jersey City, which is so close. However, just given the time, I think these three are probably the most pressing. So in Arizona, we have a militant minority of dedicated, serious, competent rank-and-file leaders, including Noah, who unfortunately isn't here, and others who were able to spend the months that it took escalating to a strike. And that includes building, as we heard, what was it, 2,000 site liaisons, and having walk-ins before school, and creating this massive Facebook page. Having the communication of knowing that your union leaders, or the rank-and-file union leaders, can take selfies of videos, keeping members up to date, to post that. I thought that was actually a really impressive tactic that I would love to bring to New York City, of keeping everyone up to date. But we see that the rank and file was very much at the forefront, and they recognized that their union leadership was sympathetic, and that the union leadership was going to let them drive the vehicle, and that the union would provide resources and provide ways to help the Arizona Educators United. And again, this is a way that we can look at the rank and file strategy in action. And so I think we should pay attention to what Noah and others said when they decided to go back to work. They said that this is very likely, based on an analysis of where things are, this is the best that we can get while staying out right now, but this is not the end of our struggle. More importantly, this is not a call to go occupy the polls, a mistake that was made in Wisconsin and in other places, in which the slide from workplace action to electoralism, unfortunately, is the death of movements. They didn't say that. They said, we're going to go back to work, and we're going to go continue and look to the next site of struggle that this will take. So, last but not least, in my notes somewhere here, I used to be an organizer with the Communications Workers of America, and I have to take every opportunity to leave with an ask. And so I would ask that if you are a radical, if you are a democratic socialist, if you are a socialist, and you are trying to find the way to participate in this strike wave that we are seeing, I would ask, have you ever thought about being a teacher? I would ask, have you ever thought about being a nurse? Have you ever thought about working in a hospital or a civil servant? If you think about it and you think you would be good in those jobs, I would highly recommend that you join us, because again, it was the rank and file teachers and leaders who were pushing the struggle to its next stages, and who are positioned to be able to connect the struggles of teachers and union members to the big picture issues, such as Medicare for all, such as full funding for public education. And so, for those of you in the room and those of you watching, please consider it and be willing to join us. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, everyone. Unfortunately, Noah is not able to connect with us anymore. It's a huge bummer. We did get a few minutes from him at least, so we can roll with that. He did want me to relay a message to y'all, so I'll do that. He says, I'm sorry that my portion was not able to work out. I'm disappointed because I wanted to provide some encouragement to take action once I got through my takeaways at the beginning. I'm glad that you all heard our main points in Arizona, but the biggest message is that the people have the power! Exclamation point. The last few sentences are all end in exclamation points, so the power is in our hands. If we can organize for change in Arizona, it's possible anywhere.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. All right, thanks a lot, y'all. Thanks, everyone in the audience. How you guys feeling? Great. Yeah, awesome. Is it okay if I pose some questions to these folks? Yeah. Okay, let's do it. I'm going to ask you guys for a few questions for a few minutes. And basically, I think the first thing I want to ask is just a general question of how you assess the moment that we're in. It seems like the post-recession era has been an era characterized by not like linear, struggle, but it's been a roller coaster. But it seems like it's like going up a little bit, the struggle everywhere. I mean, you think about Black Lives Matter, the NFL protests, even before that, Occupy, the CTU strike, the Chicago teacher strike a few years ago. Yep, the struggles right now against gun violence. The grad students at Columbia went on strike a few weeks ago. The new school is now on strike, so props to them. UC as well, and just strikes everywhere, all over the place. It seems like we're in a new moment. Me too, if I failed to say that. What is the moment? How can we explain the moment? In which direction is it going? I know we can't do any crystal ball gazing, but maybe we can make a few guesses as to what we can anticipate and how we should intervene in the moment to come. And how has the strike wave kind of impacted or kind of guided the direction of this kind of post-recession uptick and struggle? Maybe we'll start with Eric and
Sure.
around.
Yeah, I think clearly there's been a tremendous amount of struggle over the recent years, and talking to the rank and file militants who helped lead these strikes in the different states, they stress that. A lot of them, for instance, really stress the importance, for instance, of the Bernie Sanders campaign. A lot of them first got politicized in that. Others pointed to Black Lives Matter, immigrant rights. And so there's a continuity with these previous struggles. To my mind, the big question that I think a lot of us have been thinking about for all these years is, why in the United States for, I don't know, at least since I've been organizing, do we have these sort of outbursts of protest and then relatively little continuity or organization come out of that? It's a real, in some ways, a historic anomaly, where you have some of the biggest protests, anti-war in 2003, 2006 immigrant rights movement, but then it goes away. And so we can point to different reasons why it might do that, Democratic Party, et cetera. That being said, what feels to me different about this strike wave in particular is that it's leaving a residue of organization, and that's different. And I think we've seen signs of that before, that there was a turn maybe to organization. So looking at the growth of socialist organizations, including the DSA, ISO, and others, that's new. I think that people, I think there's an accumulated level of experience that people have been through these previous struggles and who are like, it's not enough just to go and protest. And so the fact that now you had organizers come out of these struggles looking to organize, and that these strikes themselves are creating both stronger unions and stronger rank and file organizations, to me, that's the most promising thing about this new moment.
Yeah, I really agree with that. I mean, the other thing to mention was just like kind of the obvious, which is Trump, right? I think Trump was a massive game changer in terms of political moment, because everything that you mentioned, Ronnie, is so important when you kind of put those markers down. I think for people in this room, those are certainly had the residue, you know what I mean, is still living in, in us. But I think what existed prior to Trump, but what is like accelerated significantly, is just a massive amount of volatility. Because for every single upsurge, for every single explosion, you also have reaction. You know what I mean? You have growth of white supremacist organizations in this country alongside massive support for Black Lives Matter. So there's both sides happening, and I think the reason why that's significant is, one, to just, we always have to recognize sort of when that kind of polarization exists, and that there's an organized right wing as well, because it gives us a sense of kind of what we're up against. But it also is the reason why I think that even during a strike wave, which is underway right now, which is profoundly inspiring, it doesn't always feel like we're in the middle of a strike wave. You know what I mean? Because of everything else that's kind of coming down by our ruling class led by Trump. That's just kind of sent everyone into a bit of a tailspin. So I think that volatility that I think you're right is sort of historically, been the case in this country in terms of that explosiveness, that produces that explosiveness that you're saying, I think has just been greatly accelerated by Trump, by the current ruling class, that's producing a kind of more unstable political terrain that has massive opportunities as well as kind of massive obstacles for us.
Yeah, I definitely agree with the incredible optimism and incredible fear about the possibilities of the moment. I think about our generation and millennials who came of age witnessing 9/11, the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the recession pretty much back to back for our coming of age, and just immediately going into the age of Trump. And I think that presents incredible skepticism of capitalism and honestly of liberalism. And unfortunately, that can go to either extreme. And so I guess a fear of mine also with the current moment is, what's the next bad thing that's coming around? And I think it very well could possibly be another war, because that's just the reality of our lives. But I see millennials, and that's not to say only millennials, looking for answers for a new way of living. And they're looking back at history and to things that occurred 100 years ago or less, and are trying to take lessons for how to live and how to make sense of our moment. And I think that we have to be there to give solutions and to give answers, and to recognize that they're not wrong for feeling alienated at this time, and they're not wrong for criticizing the lives that we have, because at times they can be pretty unbearable. And so I think this moment is ripe, and I think that the left will continue to grow. I think DSA and the ISO and other organizations and infrastructure like Verso, by the way, thanks for having us, and Jacobin are going to continue to grow, while at the same time perhaps the right wing will as well. So I really liked what you said, Leia, about we're not going to be able to control society and the state until we can really control a strike, or perhaps even more micro level, control a union. And so we're putting this into practice with the idea that taking our unions and democratizing them isn't the end-all be-all, but we're doing this because we think it's a vehicle also to democratize our world, and to make a situation where people won't feel that that the right wing and the far right is an opportunity, because the profound isolation and just oppression won't be as bad. So.
I think a question I have, and that people around me have had, is why didn't what happened in West Virginia and in Arizona, why didn't it happen in places like New York, for example? And can it happen here? I think we all agree it can happen, but what's getting in the way? I opened my UFT little newspaper that they mailed me today, and I saw the UFT officials with Governor Cuomo trying to make a deal, some local state deal that'll they wish will exempt them from some national right to work that's coming down the pipeline. What do you think that says about what's in the way of trying to replicate a struggle like West Virginia or Arizona or Oklahoma or so on and so forth, and places like New York? What's in the way?
Why don't you start first?
Myself? Sure. So I think what I've tried to coin the West Virginia strategy, and we'll see if it holds or not. But I think this is the way that we should think about organizing our unions, which is that we don't go ahead and just criticize the union leadership for being complacent or being liberal or not doing enough. Whether or not that's valid, I think that we just have to take the reins into our own hands. And we recognize when there is a well-positioned militant minority, things can be done. And we are trying to work with that and trying to find what are the issues that people are willing to organize in 2018 in New York City around. And honestly, I think it's going to take trial and error, trying to organize around things over the next couple months, seeing what works, what doesn't work, trying to build, building liaisons and site liaisons in our extent, maybe trying to create a Facebook group of New York City Educators United. We can try these different issues, and I think the time is ripe, given that our contract is expiring in the fall, and we have to keep our ideas incredibly big and our vision very big, but with realistic expectations of how we get there. It's not going to happen just because we will it, but it's going to take organizing. And I think everyone who's here in this room and a part of the organizations that are here are really committed to doing that. So.
I've been thinking about that question a lot. I'm sure we all have, being in the UFT here. The UFT, it's hard to not overstate how fundamentally anti-democratic and anti-rank and file our union is. It's just the reality in which we live. We're the largest teachers local, in the country. The union leadership of the UFT has been in power for 5 decades. They've maneuvered 6 decades. They've maneuvered their way basically to maintain that power, and they make every single rank and file initiative they just go after us every single time. And so there's just no question that they're a major obstacle to this. The reason why they're an obstacle is because their entire strategy relies fundamentally on getting a seat at the table with the Democratic Party, whether that's the city sometimes with de Blasio, and sometimes that's Cuomo, who's hated by teachers, across the state. He could not be more anti-public, public education in terms of Democrats go. That's the wing of the Democratic Party that he is on. Their entire strategy for decades has been kind of courting the Democratic Party at the expense of any kind of rank and file initiative. And so their response to Janice was, on the one hand, door knocking, which is the most they've ever done since I've been a UFT member. I've been a UFT member for 10 years. And their other strategy is, I got a union card in the mail that is going to give me discounts, at different places that I go, and it's supposed to make me feel good that I'm a member of a union, and maybe I'll keep paying my dues because I get this card in the mail. It's a losing strategy, and it's also a strategy that's meant on building passivity amongst the rank and file rather than initiative. So I think in terms of overcoming that, we're both in a rank and file caucus that's certainly attempting to do some of that work, but it's also about building kind of examples in our schools about what it's going to take to actually fight. And those fights are going to surprise you. The fight in my school was a 500-person student-led walkout around pop-up metal detectors. I didn't know that was going to happen, right? That wasn't something I could kind of predict, but it wasn't about the schedules. It wasn't about, class sizes. It was about students being treated like criminals, and that politicized my work, my workplace in a way that I couldn't have predicted. But building those kind of, I think, models school by school will be significant to kind of counter the weight of our leadership.
Yeah, so some of you might have heard the phrase "capitalism breaks at its weakest link," right? Usually that's in reference to Russia, but in some ways it's true here too, right? No, really, the weak point in some ways for the ruling class's apparatus. In terms of its ability to integrate the working class are these states, because what you have is a really different context. I think we should be aware of that. It's very rare, to say the least, that in a place like New York or California you would see Democrats out on the picket line supporting the workers on strike, right? That is not our norm. And so because of the depth of the Republican just decimation of public education, it created a breach amongst the working class, and including sectors of the establishment, really, including the Democrats and union leaderships that sort of were so forced out of power that they went along. It's interesting. They went along in most of these places with the strikes. In most places, they didn't try to stop it like they might otherwise. So that is a different context. I'm not pessimistic about that, because I think as far as the prospects nationwide, but we should recognize it, that the obstacles are greater for something like a mass strike in a place like a quote-unquote blue state, both because the Democrats and the weight of the union leadership. That being said, part of the equation then becomes is how much does the weight of the inspiration of these victorious strikes, how much can that sort of weigh in the equation that can offset the fact that there are bigger obstacles? I think it will weigh heavy. We already seen it. The strike wave is already in Colorado. Colorado is not traditionally a red state. It's a governor's Democrat. And there's talk already in Los Angeles, not just the staff worker strike, but in the fall actually talk about a real strike. Same in Massachusetts. So I think actually we should be expecting the strike wave in education to continue into quote-unquote blue states, but we know that's going to be much uglier. And if we saw the role that the establishment Democrats and the Democratic Party in general played in Chicago, I think that's the type of thing we're going to expect. So it's going to get a lot more heated, and the kind of friendly press and friendly liberals on strikes, I think we can expect some of them to drop away in these types of contexts.
Mm-hmm. Ryan was trying to come back for a second.
So I thought of something really quick while you were talking. So we're not just learning the blueprints of how to organize from these strikes, but there's actually a concrete material organizational benefit that we get from when they go on strike. We can use that as a way to organize at our schools as well. Even something as small as taking a solidarity photo at your school and sending it to striking teachers is a way for you to talk about, oh, this is what teachers are striking about in Arizona. Are you willing to stand up and say that I support them striking about it? That's a way that also you can assess which people in your staff are willing to take that photo and which do you have to go and have more and more conversations. And so I see this strike wave, you're totally right, is going to be really ugly when it comes to the blue states. But I still think that we should keep our eye on how do we create the capacity and how do we build organizers to be able to take that when it comes.
So I think a theme tonight has been the kind of the need to build organization and produce more militants who can therefore direct the struggles that are to come. 2018 is an election year, mid-year, I guess, election, and you guys brought up the Democrats, Mayor Rahm. Hear me okay? Okay. Democrats, as you guys have mentioned, have been pretty nasty to teachers throughout the country. You think of, for example, Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel, who, he he opposed the Chicago teachers when they went on strike. Got pretty ugly. How do you think 2018 will affect the strike wave that maybe, Eric, you're predicting will continue? I won't put words in your mouth, I guess, but if there is an uptick in struggle, right, which it seems like that's the case, how will 2018 and the voting for the lesser evil, how do you think that will affect the uptick? Do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I guess as I said before, I mean, I think the pull towards electoralism is just massive in the public sector. I mean, you get to elect your boss. You know what I mean? Like, there's no other sector that's kind of true for. And so in a way, it kind of pulls people even in their most militant moment. Like, you think about kind of, was it West Virginia, where there was also a common chant of vote them out at the same time that they're exercising, massive working class power. And so I think that is going to be a huge contradiction that the movements are going to have to face. And I think the only way for there to be a kind of way forward, I would say argue away from that kind of strategy of kind of the occupy the polls that Ryan mentioned, or the kind of just focusing on the vote them out, is to build the kind of organization that can pose that strategy. Because without that, I mean, I think it's going to be, it is absolutely true. There's been a bipartisan war on public education. I think that most educators are very aware, of that. There's not, it's not to say that people aren't Democratic voters, because massively they are, but there's also not also massive illusions, in the political class just in general, I think because of the betrayals that existed certainly for decades. But I think because there's also a stronger left Democratic, because of Sanders has created kind of a left Democratic base, I think we should also expect there to be Democratic politicians that are totally going to walk the picket lines to get elected. They're totally going to be that kind of left face, pro-teacher, vote for me, I'm going to help you save kind of public education, I have your back. And I think we have to be just as wary as those as we do to the Cuomos of the world, and people that are literally out to destroy public education. So, I mean, obviously it's yet to be seen, kind of what impact it will have. I think the only way, if we agree that would not be an effective strategy to sort of advance this strike wave, is to build the kind of rank and file organizations that we are witnessing being born and that we're involved in building, that can kind of have those debates out independent of them to kind of argue a way forward.
Yeah, so I agree that there's a really big danger with absorption into the Democratic Party in particular. That being said, just to again acknowledge that for the contradictions, which is that a lot of these strike leaders first got politicized through the Bernie Sanders campaign, which was in, within the Democratic Party apparatus. So that being said, it's a very contradictory situation. And it's important to stress because there's reasons why, it's not just illusion, there's reason why strikers feel like, yeah, voting out these Republicans makes a lot of sense. They're like some evil fuckers, really. And so you can understand, especially when you're getting attacked by them, it's a logical next step in their mind, right? To be like, yeah, let's vote them out. Even if we don't fully trust them, there's going to be a huge push toward the Democrats in November, and it's going to be hard in that context to maintain independence. So I think for us as socialists, the question is, how do we, given that context, best help the movement stay independent to the extent possible? And I think there's a few ways. One is crucially having some sort of independent campaign ahead of time and independent mobilization that poses a different perspective. So for instance, in West Virginia, I'm really excited that the leaders on the ground, the rank and file comrades, they're pushing for a campaign around PEIA, the health insurance, right? Like, independently of who gets elected, there needs to be a mass mobilization to call on all the politicians to tax the rich and tax the corporations so that there's funds for healthcare, right? And so they're beginning a mass campaign around that. And also, I think that actually the initiative in Arizona is really promising to, instead of pivoting towards electing bad liberal Democrats, tax the rich. That's great. Right. Yeah, I think that's a good way of channeling people's understandable electoral desire to use the electoral arena that we shouldn't minimize, but to give it a productive channel. And so in California, a few years ago, some of you might remember, we had a Tax the Millionaires, right? And that was great. And I think that if out of Arizona we can project like every state should have ballot initiatives to tax the rich, let's do it. I don't see any reason why that can't be our alternative in the short run to just getting absorbed into the Democratic Party. I think that's a great alternative.
So I entirely agree that electoralism is a dead end, and I think that it is where movements go to die. I make the distinction between electoralism and elections, however, and I think that there are strategic ways, as Eric is laying out, that we can use elections for our advantage. So the Bernie Sanders campaign happened during the last Verizon strike, and I think we can all say that Bernie giving those strikers a platform is one of the ways in which they were able to win. And I think that there's a very good chance that Bernie is going to be running again. And I think that we, as independent socialists, should be thinking, how are we going to use that campaign to our advantage? How are teachers in West Virginia going to use that to their advantage when fighting for PEIA? Not saying they drop everything and go engage in that campaign, but how do they connect the idea of Medicare for all to full funding for PEIA? I think that we should certainly view elections strategically and be incredibly critical of electoralism and the Democratic Party. I think that we can have independent political organization while simultaneously using elections when strategically viable. I know that for DSA, we are running 2 DSA members in local elections in this fall, including a state senator or someone running for state senate in Brooklyn and someone running for Congress up in Queens and in the Bronx. So how to create a situation in which I don't feel compelled to stop what I'm doing to organize around our contract in the UFT, which expires in November, or stop organizing around paid family leave to drop everything and go knock doors for a candidate? How do I recognize that a candidate can be a way to push my platform of my politics and my ideas, and honestly, our issues as unionists? And I think that that is a way that we should be looking at elections. It's just purely strategically recognizing the limitations of electoralism, recognizing the limitations of the Democratic Party, but being strategically honest that we can use these to our advantage.
Can I ask you a little bit of how to navigate? Because that seems pretty tricky. On the one hand, it's election season, and a campaign requires a lot of resources. How do you navigate between canvassing for encouraging people to canvass for a particular candidate and trying to, I guess, continue building movements, class struggle?
Absolutely. So I would say in DSA right now, we have a national campaign for Medicare for All. So that includes teach-ins outside of UC campuses right now around the idea of Medicare for All and for a national policy for Medicare for All, aka universal health care to those who are confused. So I think that there's a way that we can plug in the policies and the politicians into our work that we are doing. And I think that as long as you're not leaving your union or your movement work to do elections, then I don't see that as electoralism. So I think and yes, there are limited resources, and I guess I would take the side to any union or rank and file organization or independent socialist organization that we should prioritize resources and funding to building class struggle movements and not elections. However, I think you can do both. And I think that when you can tie in the issues, that is the number one way that you can win. Again, just so I spoke about UC, but in West Virginia as well, they're pushing for Medicare for all within their fund for PEIA. So saying in the short term we want to fight for funding for PEIA, but recognizing that this will not be solved until we have Medicare for all.
Okay, we're about coming to the end of our panel discussion here. Why don't we move on to closing remarks? Unless you guys want another question. You seem like
Are you going to do announcements first, or you just close?
Oh, yeah, that's right. Announcements. Thank you. Can we get, I think Sherry has an announcement, and followed by Leader.
Yeah, you got to get up
please use
here.
the mic.
Gotta get up here. All right.
It doesn't come off. Here, why don't you just take my seat?
Okay, just briefly. First, thanks. That was fantastic. And if you like stuff like this, then this is basically what I'm here to announce. July 5th to 8th in Chicago is Socialism 2018. It's basically 4 days of this kind of discussion, only carried out with 2,000 people, over 150 meetings with people from Boots Riley of the Coup to Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, everything from theoretical, political, to historical questions and debates. And the point is, we all know the stakes are incredibly high right now. We're all involved to some degree in trying to figure out challenges that we have never faced before. We need each other in ways that we have never, in some ways, needed each other before. And this conference, sponsored every year now by Haymarket Books, International Socialist Review, Jacobin, Socialist Worker, the International Socialist Organization, is a means of the revolutionary and democratic socialist left having out debates, discussions, educating each other, reaching out to a much broader periphery of thousands of people to actually deepen our political understanding so that we can actually be more effective fighters to fight for a different kind of world. It is an intolerable status quo right now for all of us. And these are places for us to come together and figure shit out in comradely, often fun, ever challenging, but very, very dear, beautiful, venues. So these are the conference brochures. If you don't have one yet, it's $50 for student registration, $85 for those who are non-students. No one turned away for lack of funds. We'll figure stuff out. We're working out transportation, housing, all the rest to move people by the hundreds from New York City to Chicago the Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday of July 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th. It is absolutely worth it. It is transformative, to be honest. There is nothing like this in this country. Come.
Hello, y'all. Thank you so much for coming. I wanted to thank again Verso for helping us to provide their space and let us invade their workspace for another night. I just wanted to talk really quickly about an upcoming meeting on May 21st, which is a Monday, at the Brooklyn Commons on 388 Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn, New York. It's called Inside Syria's Democratic Struggle with the Nanga-Paul. Nanga-Paul is a reporter and author just back from Syria. His book, No Good Men Among the Living, America, the Taliban, and the War Through Afghan Eyes, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. This is a book that came out a few years ago. He's written extensively about what was going on in Afghanistan and in Syria, especially during the Arab Spring and during the Iraq War. Him, as well as Rama Kudami, is a Syrian-American activist and a member of the Syrian Solidarity Collective. She is also on the National Committee of the War Resisters League. And another speaker, Yasser Manif, is a Syrian scholar who specializes in grassroots movements in Syria. He has made several trips there, most recently in 2015 when he visited the Syrian-Turkish border. He's a sociology professor at Emerson College and a co-founder of the Campaign for Global Solidarity with the Syrian Revolution. Sponsors include Promoting Enduring Peace, International Socialist Organization, and the Global Campaign in Solidarity with the Syrian Revolution. It's on May 21st, a Monday at 6:30 p.m. at the Commons. If you're interested, definitely talk to me. I'll be here all night, until they kick me out anyway. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. People in the audience, after the panel is done, I see refreshments over there for sale, so make sure that you hang around after and talk and meet people. I also see that Haymarket Books is selling books, and I think they're 30% off. Okay, so make sure you get some books. And yeah, we're coming to the end. Maybe we can go in reverse order. Start with Ryan, then Leah, then Eric will finish us off.
All right, cool. So I already asked you all to become teachers, and I hope you've thought about it and let it marinate for a little bit. And I'm going to end this asking again. But I want to say that being a teacher is not just a matter of being a union militant. But you have a class of, let's say, 20, if you're lucky, students in which you can talk about ideas all day, and you can help them learn to critically think and start to analyze their world and plan ways that they can change it. And so a really cool way that we used the West Virginia model in New York City was when we were fighting for paid family leave. We organized a march from the union headquarters to the DOE saying that we want full funding for paid family leave with no givebacks. So we show up, and to our surprise, the union leadership is outside with their banners. And we're like, holy cow, they're trying to co-opt this. But I was like, that's good. Let them try. Because, bringing up Kim Moody again, the idea of the rank and file strategy is that you always keep your sights set on the boss. In our case, we could say that that is the neoliberal and conservative politicians and the industries that they represent in New York City, of course, that being finance and real estate. So if we keep our aim on that, it is up to the union leadership to make sure that they're not caught in that crossfire and that they get behind us and push us along the way. So we made that a reality in New York City in our fight for paid family leave. Not to mention when I show up to work the next day, then my student Angel is like, "Mister, were you on New York 1 last night?" And I was like, "Angel, I was, but the coolest thing about this is that you watched New York 1 in the morning before school." So it's a way that we can tie our movement as teachers to the movements of students. And clearly the moment right now with the walkout around gun control, schools are politicizing places, and we should certainly be looking for ways that we can struggle together with our students and families.
So I think I'm going to say something that I hope complements that, which is I think that you don't have to be a teacher to have a stake in the fight for public education. I think one of the unique things also about the public sector and about the fight for public education is that every single person here is likely a product of the public education system, has a public school in their neighborhood, sends their kids to public schools. And I think that that's the important thing about this fight is that you don't actually have to be a teacher to be engaged in the struggle for public education, whether there's a school closing, a testing regime underway in your kid's school, that you can actually build a campaign and help fight around. I think as the strike wave continues, I have heard murmurings, also in places like Wisconsin. Again, I think the question of solidarity is absolutely critical from perhaps more importantly outside the ranks, of teachers and what it means to actually build solidarity campaigns. I think if you have the opportunity to go with DSA or the ISO as part of a socialist delegation to these striking states and cities, it'll be absolutely transformative. It is one thing to believe in class struggle. It is one thing to know it exists, that it can't exist, that it exists right now. It's another thing to witness it, to be able to interview the people on the front lines, do what Eric did. I know there are other people in this room that went on delegations and reported for Socialist Worker. It's absolutely transformative to see the working class in motion. I had the privilege of doing that in the Madison occupation. I also had the privilege of doing that in the Standing Rock. And it just forever changed me in terms of my belief in the capacity of our side, not just to fight, but to actually fight for much more than just themselves. And, it matters to be organized, obviously. You can't do this as an individual, but it also matters what politics you're organized around. I think that the point that was made about the kind of opening for socialists right now just can't be underestimated, that the growth of socialist organization is going to mean the growth of a militant minority, and that our focus has to be just as much on kind of building the working class kind of action as it does building working class politics around the politics of self-activity and self-emancipation that I think is near and dear to, every socialist's heart.
Cool. So, I'd like to do 3 thank yous. First of all, thank you to everyone here for coming out. So maybe pat you back. Pat yourself. The second thank you I want to give is just a huge shout out to the rank and file leaders of these strikes. It's we can't underestimate the courage and sacrifice that individuals went into, not knowing whether they would win or not, and sometimes not winning, and under tremendous family pressures, tremendous pressures in states and contexts in which fear of the right wing and fear of violence against them is a real thing. I can't actually put it into words, the amount of courage and just sheer working class heroism of these individuals who in particular put their asses on the line for all of us. That is just a tremendously inspirational thing. So I just want to do a few personal shout outs to them. Emily in West Virginia, Emily, Jay, Nicole, Olivia, we all owe you so much. Oklahoma, Stephanie, Katie, Arizona, Noah, Dylan, Rebecca, you all, if you're watching this, maybe you're not,